All right, let's continue with the identify step, part 2, where the goal is to work on identifying the key fields for both the primary and dimensional entities. Remember this? The real-time customer profile always defines a person, their traits, and their associated behaviors with a brand or company. When we talk about the primary entity, we're talking about the core of the real-time customer profile, which is composed of 2 classes of data: XDM individual profile, the traits of a person, and experience event, the behaviors of a person. Dimensional entity data, or lookup data, is used to provide additional context to either a trait or a behavior a person performed. Any data that exists outside the primary dimensional entities will always have to be denormalized back into one of their associated parent tables. In this step, we are only concerned with the primary and dimensional entities of the profile. So anything labeled previously as either a B or a D, we're going to ignore. Now, there are 2 pieces to identifying key fields. The first set of fields to identify are the identities and relationships of each table that is part of the primary and dimensional entities of the profile. The 3 important ones to identify are the primary identity, person identity, and relationship identity. The primary identity, this is used as a storage key and required for any schema that's going to be used with a real-time customer profile. For the primary entity schemas, the identity also uniquely identifies a person. So you can think of this as, who does this record belong to? Next is the person identity. This is used in conjunction with a primary identity to create relationships in the identity graph, and it's also used to uniquely identify a person. Now note, person identities are only ever used within the primary entity itself of profile, and the primary entity being individual profile and experience event-based schemas or tables. The relationship identity is what we refer to as a non-person identifier. It's really used just to describe the relationships from one of these primary entity tables of the real-time customer profile to an associated dimensional entity table, or the lookups. These are never used for creating a unified view of a customer, and they do not participate in anything with identity graph. The second set of fields to identify are the required fields, which only apply to the tables labeled with an E, or the experience event data. Now, all experience event tables require 2 things. First is what we call the underscore ID. This is used by the real-time customer profile in conjunction with the primary identity to create a unique storage key for the event. It's always required as events are considered immutable, meaning they're distinctly unique. Very different than a relational system many of you will come from, where these are considered mutable. We'll talk about this more later. The next required field is a timestamp. All events happen at a given time, and therefore, every event requires a timestamp. It is impossible to provide an event to the Adobe Experience Platform and not have a time it occurred. At that point, was there really something that happened? The last field is not required, but I highly encourage you to use it, and this is the event type. The event type's primary purpose is in the segmentation experience used by the marketer. While it's not required, it greatly simplifies the segmentation experience. Think of an event type as describing the high-level behavior of the event itself. Is this table representing a purchase? Is it representing a reservation? Maybe it's representing a reservation type of booked or canceled. The event type, again, is not a required field, but I highly encourage you, when using the LID methodology, to always find it in the event tables. So how do we start with the second step of identify? It's actually fairly easy. All we need to do is focus on the primary entity schemas within the real-time customer profile and the supported entities. At this point, you need to be aware of what we refer to as bridge table rule number 2. Rule number 2 states the following. In situations where a bridge table exists between a P or an E, the parent table, and a lookup table, or L, treat the bridge table as part of the parent table. We do this because the relationship is always going to be written on the bridge table, and relationships must always be written from the parent to the lookup. As always, let's start at the individual profile table we labeled and start with identifying the primary identity of that table. Now remember, the primary identity is the storage key, and therefore it must always be present. Also, this primary identifier signifies what person these traits belong to. So having it empty would mean that you have a trait of someone, but you don't know who the person is. It's kind of an awkward scenario. If we look at the customer table here from the demo data model, you'll notice that the field name customer ID is labeled with a PK, which signifies it's a primary key in the relational world. This means that field will always exist, so it's likely a good candidate for the primary identity. You'll also notice the fields of mobile phone and email ID are present, but we don't have enough information on whether those are unique to a person, meaning they're not shared, and if they always exist for every record in the customer table. We would need to ask more questions of the data architect to understand how these fields are used. If we assume the customer ID is a valid identifier of a person and not an auto PK from the database, then it's likely the best candidate at this point for the primary identity, and therefore we should label the customer ID with a PI. Next, we want to identify any other person identities. At this point, you need to be very careful with just wishfully picking values. This is usually where most customers run into a trap. The criteria for picking other identity values means that the following must be true. 1, the identity in question has to be unique to only one profile. It cannot be shared across other profiles. And 2, the identity in question has to have a valid use case beyond just being an identity. This means you either need it for activation purposes, or it's required to relate to other data sources, but again, it must only be unique to one profile. In this demo data model, we kind of know a little bit more information up front, and I know that the email ID is unique in context of the customer ID, meaning it'll never repeat for a different customer ID. But I also know that the mobile phone is not unique. This may mean the mobile phone is consistently being used across multiple customer IDs or multiple email addresses, or maybe it's just not populated at all. Therefore, I wouldn't use mobile phone for fear of relating two profiles together that should not be related. And I instead would use the email ID, as I know that it can uniquely be used to identify who this profile is in context of the customer ID. And therefore, I'd label it with an I. Next, we want to identify any relationship identities that link to the lookup tables. At this point, bridge table rule number 2 kicks in because the relationship is always going to be marked on a field likely within your bridge table. In this case, the location ID field within the customer location table. This field is not part of the customer table, but because of bridge table rule number 2, you can treat it as if it is. Therefore, the location ID field is labeled with an R on that table. Next, we're going to move on to the experience event tables, and we're going to follow the same set of steps. We first want to identify the primary identity of the sales transaction table. Now remember, this should signify what person the sales transaction belongs to. In this case, the only viable field here is the customer ID, and therefore this would be labeled as a PI. If, in a scenario, you could not find something to label, it begs the question of how did this become an event table to begin with? So keep that in mind. You also may run into a scenario where the field that you do want to label on an event is not always populated. This likely highlights scenarios where you have, in the retail space, sales transactions coming in at a register, but there's no identification method of who's making that purchase. Be careful at this point to label fields just to try to get them to relate. Remember, this transaction needs to be uniquely related back to a single profile. Two people cannot both generate the exact same event. An event is always unique back to a single individual. Next, we want to identify any other person-based identities that are in this event that could be used. In this case, nothing else appears as an option, and so we can move on to the next step. Now we want to identify any relationship identities that can provide reference to the two lookup tables we see in here sitting on the left and the right in form of product and store. The foreign key values of the product ID and store ID, marked as FK on the diagram should be labeled or marked with R, signifying they are relationships for how we get to the lookup tables themselves. Now come the required fields. Remember, only the experience event has required fields. And the first one is the _ID field, which is meant to uniquely identify the event. Keep in mind, events are immutable in the real-time customer profile. Immutable means they cannot repeat. Looking at the schema, the best option looks like sales transaction ID. And that's probably what you're thinking you should label as the _ID. But there's also a last status update field that can be found in the schema. Interestingly enough, this last status update field probably was added because of the status column. The sales transaction ID at this point looks like a valid candidate for the unique identifier of the event, or the _ID. But that's the trap. In the relational world, this is a mutable event, meaning it can mutate over time. If you notice, there's also a field called the last status update, and it can be assumed that the relational model is not keeping a history of how the event is evolving over time, given that this field exists. Knowing now that the sales transaction ID is mutable, meaning the record can mutate over time, if you were to choose the sales transaction ID as the _ID, every time the transaction would mutate or change status, say from ordered to shipped, the second event that you would send into the real-time customer profile would be seen as a duplicate, and we would ignore it at ingestion time. This is where something interesting shows up. In most relational models, behavioral tables contain status fields, along with sometimes a last updated field to track when a record has changed states, when something has gone from purchased to shipped. Instead of maintaining a massive volume of records that will degrade overall system performance, this optimization was actually made early on in relational databases, as they could not handle the larger table scans, and ultimately has carried through into system design even to this day. Now remember, the real-time customer profile requires immutable events. And while this may seem like a friction point, there's actually a lot of power in having events at an immutable level. For the marketer, it unlocks the ability for them to create behavioral-driven audiences and journeys. With immutable event, a marketer could not define an audience of people who ordered and then, say, canceled their order before it shipped. They would only ever know the last state of the event coming from the relational system. They would know that an order was canceled. In the NoSQL system of the real-time customer profile, the marketer could easily define an audience of people who, say, placed an order, followed immediately by a cancellation, and where that exact sequence happened in under 30 minutes. That's the power of an immutable event. So, what do? You can't use the sales transaction ID as the ID, as we said it's mutable. So the answer is you need to create the _ID. And it's actually pretty simple. Here, you should use a sales transaction ID and the last status update from the table in a concatenated fashion to create the unique ID. This way, every time the record is changed, the ID, by default, is also changed, allowing you to capture each mutation of the record within the real-time customer profile. Next, you need to identify the timestamp for when the event occurred. Once again, you'll notice the trap of mutable events. There are 2 dates present in the sales transaction table that you can use: transaction date and last status update. So which one do you use? Your gut is going to tell you to use transaction date because that's when the transaction occurred, which is accurate. But that's only accurate for the very first mutation of the event, or the first statement of the event. The answer is actually to use the last status update because it will always update every time the record mutates. And so you should label this at this point with a T. Now, the last thing you need to identify is the event type. While this is not a required field, I think it's important enough that you should always label it and/or find it. Remember, the event type describes the high-level behavior of the event data. Was this a purchase? Was it a reservation? Was it a return? As a rule of thumb, anytime you see a status type field in a table, it's likely a great candidate for the event type. Worst case is if you don't have something, make something up. right? The goal of this is to make it easy for a marketer to quickly find the events they're interested in and to use those as they're building their own audiences. For the sales transaction table, the sales status field is likely the best candidate, and therefore we should label that as the ET or the event type. Last is the lookup tables. And thank heavens, those are the easiest ones to identify things for because you only are required to find the primary identity. Remember, if you want to load data to the profile, it always requires a primary identity. And with lookup tables, finding the primary identity is as simple as finding the primary key of the table. That's always the primary identity. And therefore, if we look at all three lookup tables, I can simply mark the PI wherever I see the PK. So, when you're done, your entity relationship diagram would now look something like this. Every schema or table is labeled. And of the primary entity and dimensional entity tables, that is, the individual profile, the experience event, and lookup tables, you will have identified the key fields that are required to model those within the experience model data system itself.